The fact sheet there, and with this I'll come to an end, the fact sheet talks a little bit about, interrogates this question of resources, and I think if we're to look at the underlying structural causes behind economic and social rights fulfillment in the US, we need to interrogate the question of resources, how they are generated, how they're distributed, how budget priorities are designed and decided. For example, defense spending, I mean, this is well known, defense spending in the US dwarfs defense spending in just about any other country. And yet social spending, we've done a ranking of social spending across OECD countries, at least up until the most recent data available, social spending lags behind that of any other OECD country. Of course, there's been a lot of attention recently on health and healthcare coverage. If you look at health spending, at least the proportion of health spending that is attributable to public spending. Health spending as a whole is pretty large in the US, but the public share of that is the lowest, again, of any rich country. It's on a par with Mexico. And that has to have a direct bearing on why so many people are still unable to access affordable healthcare, and why the US, in comparison to other countries, again, this statistic is in the fact sheet, why in the US more people than in any other rich country or developed country, industrialized country, report an inability to access basic healthcare, to meet their basic healthcare needs. So I want to end with that in terms of, by way of stimulating a discussion around what we've heard this morning in terms of the US UPR session, and what needs to be done to address some of these persistent economic and social rights concerns. I would encourage us really to push on the issue of ratification of the core international treaties that have a bearing on economic and social rights. And there, it's important to remember that it's not just the covenant on the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, but that CEDAW, the Women's Convention, the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, are all of immense relevance to economic and social rights fulfillment, particularly of groups facing systemic disadvantage. I was surprised and somewhat taken aback to hear the kinds of arguments that were being advanced this morning by the very slick delegation, I have to say, the delegation. Those of you who've seen other UPR processes will realize that this was a pretty good performance by the US. The kinds of responses that were given on the question of why we don't ratify. Well, I certainly hadn't heard this before. Perhaps those of you that are more steeped in US activism are used to hearing this argument that, well, the US doesn't ratify instruments until it gets its own house in order and it wants to put its domestic legislation in place before we ratify. In other words, don't hold your breath. That's what I have. I think it's really important, and I would just put this out there, that we, in our campaigning strategies, those of us that are advocacy organizations, do put a lot of emphasis on the question of ratification not just as a symbolic step, but as a spearhead for ensuring that real change comes about in policy as well as in law. And so our kinds of counter-arguments I was hearing this morning from the US administration, I think only strengthens our determination, or my conviction at least, that at the centre that we really need to push on ratification. It was astounding that so many countries mentioned and called on the US to ratify not just the covenant but other critical instruments. Perhaps I'll end with that. I mean, I think other proposals around strategy will emerge from my fellow panelists and from the discussion.
Thank you, Ignacio. Next, we're going to hear from Radhika Balakrishnan, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Women's Global Leadership, who will address some of the systemic and regulatory issues at play in talking about economic and social rights in the United States.
Thank you very much. I want to continue Ignacio's throwing out of numbers and have just one more number, and I think it's very telling in terms of the title of our panel, in terms of the land of plenty and the freedom from want. The number that is so striking to me is the change in household income from 1979 to 2005, and I won't read you all the numbers, but really just two relevant ones. The bottom fifth of the population from 1979 to 2005, their income for a household went up $500 in real dollars. Whereas the top 1%, the top 1% in that same time, a household income went up $6 million. So the land of plenty is a small percentage of the population that is getting the benefits of the plenty that's being created. And the number next to it, which was 99%, was only 700,000. So it's not even that, the top 1% made 6 million and then it sort of, went down. It's in the bottom, it goes a little bit up, and then that top 1% has got 6 million. So there's an incredible issue of not just inequality, but about the control of resources by the top 1% of the population. And so in that context, and I think when we talk about economic and social rights, I think we need to talk about it in the context of actual policy measures on economic policy. I mean, one of the things that is often said is that economic policy is something that's technical. Right? I'm an economist, so it's something that economists know about, and that's technical. And human rights are something that's aspirational. And so the technical people will do economic policy, and human rights will aspire to some kind of goal. But what I would like to argue is that human rights actually gives us an ethical lens to assess economic policy, because one of the things that's happened over the last 30 years is that the kind of economic policy that's been in place in the United States, and actually quite globally, is a particular kind of economic policy. And so we might argue about the left or the right, but we've sort of lost an ethical lens by which we can say, well, what's the purpose of this policy? Is the purpose of this policy to have the 1% get 6 million and the bottom 500? Or is there some other purpose of economic policy? And I would say that there is another purpose, right? The economy is for us. I mean, we make it up. We're people who live in it. And so we participate in it because there's something it's supposed to do for us. And what is it that it's going to do? So I want to focus really on two aspects of economic policy, and we could be here all day talking about all aspects of economic policy. And one is the issue of financial regulation. And you don't usually talk about financial regulation and human rights in the same sentence, but I think it's about time that we did. The crisis, the financial crisis that started in the U.S. and the economic crisis that the entire world is suffering from, started because of very deliberate legislative measures that were put into place in the United States that allowed the crisis to happen. And so I won't go through all the different legislative changes, but there was an act called the Glass-Steagall Act that was put into place after the Great Depression to really protect us from the kind of crisis that we just saw happen. That was revoked in 1999 with the Financial Modernization Act. And what that did was it allowed for the kind of speculative investment that we saw the bubble grow and collapse over. New financial instruments that allowed commercial banks to do what financial institutions did. And that act was really made by 4 people in a room. There was absolutely no accountability, no participation, and I'm not even sure how much participation the government had in that decision. It was really a decision to make Citibank Citigroup, and we're all suffering from that one act. And so I think now that the Obama administration has talked about setting up new financial regulatory frameworks, I think as human rights, we can actually enter that conversation and say, okay, if you are going to do new financial regulation, then you have an obligation to protect. That is a human rights obligation, and this crisis is a failure of the U.S. government to protect. I mean, that's why it happened. They did not do their job in terms of human rights obligations. So, and what is the public debate about the obligation to protect? And not just protect that top 1%'s interest in making the $6 million, but protect all of us from the acts of third party. That's what the obligation to protect says, right? That the government has an obligation to protect from third party interests. It's very clear what those third party interests are and who has gained from those third party interests.